I've never been a man who believes in ghosts, but the moment I drove back into Cedar Creek, I felt my father's ghost everywhere. It was in the rust-eaten sign for the town limits, in the tired slump of the buildings on Main Street, and most of all, it was in the suffocating silence. This wasn't the town I grew up in. This was a town on its knees, and everyone knew who held the whip, the Weston family. Their name was plastered on everything. From the new Weston Estates development that had chewed up the old woods to the pristine Weston Plaza that had bled Main Street dry. They owned the bank, the grocery store, and from the looks of it, they owned the soul of the town too. I was only back for one reason: to bury my father, a man who had stubbornly refused to sell his soul, and as a result, had died with little more than dust in his pockets. And I was here to deal with the one thing he'd left me, the physical manifestation of his beautiful, stubborn failure. A rundown bait and tackle shop called the Angler's Nook. The funeral was a grim, quiet affair. My siblings, Caleb and Sarah, were there, playing their parts. Caleb, with his perfectly tailored suit and expensive watch, put a firm, meaningless hand on my shoulder. Sarah, dabbing at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, whispered about how Dad is in a better place. They were actors in a play I wanted no part in. The real performance I knew would come later, at the lawyer's office. We sat in leather chairs that cost more than my car, in an office that smelled of old paper and new money. Mr. Hemlock, the family lawyer, for as long as I could remember, cleared his throat and read my father's last will and testament. It was short and brutal. To my beloved son Caleb and my darling daughter Sarah, he bequeathed his entire land holdings. 40 acres of prime, undeveloped property bordering the new Weston golf course. The land my great-grandfather had farmed. The land worth a small fortune. My siblings exchanged a look of practiced, somber victory. Then Hemlock adjusted his glasses and read the final line. And to my son Martin, I leave my business, the Angler's Nook, and everything therein, in the hopes that he can find more value in it than I ever could. The air in the room shifted. Caleb couldn't quite hide his smirk. Sarah's expression was one of pure condescending pity. I was the responsible one, the one who'd left Cedar Creek to make my own way, to build a life without relying on family money or connections. And this was my reward: a dusty, worthless shop, a joke. The ride back to the sad little motel I was staying in was a blur of self-pity and anger. But the real humiliation came later that evening. I was sitting on the edge of the lumpy mattress when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Caleb. Meet us at the Overlook. Family drink. It wasn't a request. The Overlook was a new, ridiculously fancy restaurant with a panoramic view of the valley, perched on a hill, owned by, you guessed it, the Westons. When I walked in, Caleb and Sarah were already at a prime table, a bottle of champagne sweating in a silver bucket between them. They were celebrating. Martin, over here, Caleb called out, a little too loudly. Have a drink. Toast to Dad's legacy. I sat down, the worn denim of my jeans, feeling out of place against the plush upholstery. A waiter appeared, and before I could speak, Sarah waved him away. He's fine, she said, her eyes glinting. So Caleb began, leaning forward like a predator. What are you going to do with the inheritance? He said the word like it was a piece of rotten fruit. I don't know yet, Caleb. I just buried him today. Well, don't take too long, Sarah chimed in, swirling her champagne. Property taxes are due next month. I'd hate for you to lose the family jewel over a few $100s. The barb landed, sharp and deep. They knew I wasn't rolling in cash. I had a steady job, a life I'd built from scratch, but I didn't have the kind of money they were used to. It's a shame, really, Caleb continued. The picture of false sympathy. Dad poured his whole life into that place. And for what? So the last 3 fishermen in Cedar Creek have a place to buy worms. He laughed, a short, ugly bark. Maybe the Westons will buy it for a few grand, just to knock it down and put up a parking lot. At least you'd get something out of it. We could use a few more parking spots for the new clubhouse. That was it. That was the moment the grief curdled into something cold and hard. It wasn't about the will. It wasn't about the land or the money. It was about this, the glee in their eyes, the casual, lifelong cruelty of it. They didn't just see me as the lesser sibling, they enjoyed it. They savored it. My father was dead, and all they could think about was how his legacy had cemented their superiority over me. I stood up, my chair scraping against the polished floor. I didn't say a word. I just looked at them, at their smug, satisfied faces, and I felt a switch flip inside me. Something deep and fundamental shifted. They thought I was stuck with a worthless pile of junk. They thought I had lost. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that the game hadn't even started yet. I walked out of that restaurant, leaving them to their champagne, and for the first time since I'd gotten back to Cedar Creek, I knew exactly where I was going. I was going to my inheritance. I was going to the shop. The key felt strange in my hand, a cold piece of metal I hadn't touched in over a decade. It scraped in the lock, a sound of protest from years of disuse. Pushing the door open, I was hit by a wall of smells, the dry, papery scent of dust, the faint, phantom odor of dried minnows and night crawlers, the metallic tang of old hooks, and beneath it all, the undeniable scent of failure. It was the smell of my father's last years. The air was thick and still, a time capsule of disappointment. A single beam of pale moonlight cut through the grimy front window, illuminating a universe of dust motes dancing in the silence. I walked through the narrow aisles, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive quiet. Fishing rods, brittle with age, stood in a dusty rack like skeletal sentinels. Lures with faded feathers and rusted hooks lay in their plastic compartments, their promises of a prize-winning catch long since broken. On the counter, a cash register from the Stone Age sat with its drawer slightly ajar, empty. This was it. This was my father's kingdom. A crumbling empire of forgotten hobbies and lost hope. My siblings' voices echoed in my head. What are you going to do? Sell worms? Sarah's pitying smile. Caleb's mocking laugh. For a long, dark moment, I let the despair wash over me. I sank down onto an old wooden stool behind the counter, the same one my dad used to sit on, and I put my head in my hands. They were right. It was worthless. A monument to a man who fought a battle he was always going to lose. The smart thing to do was to call a junk removal service, board up the windows, and get the hell out of this ghost town. I could be on the highway, heading back to my real life, in an hour. Forget the Westons, forget my family, forget all of it. But I couldn't move. I was pinned there by the weight of memory. I looked around the shop, and suddenly, I wasn't seeing the decay. I was seeing it through the eyes of a boy. This was where Dad taught me how to tie a proper fisherman's knot, his big, calloused hands patiently guiding my clumsy little fingers. This was where he'd let me scoop the minnows out of the tank, the cold water and slippery fish, a forbidden thrill. A vivid memory flooded my mind, so clear it felt like it was happening right now. I was 16. My dad was standing right where I was sitting, his face beaming with pride. He'd just hung the new hand-painted sign out front. The angler's nook for the real folk of Cedar Creek. He had believed in that. He believed this shop was more than a business. It was a service, a holdout against the slow creeping gentrification the Westons were bringing. He wanted a place where a guy who worked at the mill could afford to take his kid fishing on a Saturday, not some glossy emporium for wealthy weekenders from the city. He'd looked at me, his eyes full of hope, and said, "This place is about community, Martin. It's about remembering who we are." Then, another memory, darker this time, from just a few years later. The Weston's Outdoor Emporium had opened at the edge of town. It was a behemoth, a big box store with sterile aisles and prices my dad could never compete with. I remember coming into the shop one afternoon and finding him on the phone, his voice tight with frustration. "What do you mean you can't fill the order? I've been your customer for 10 years. He hung up, his face grim. The supplier, his main line for the most popular lures, had signed an exclusive deal with the Emporium. The Westons weren't just competing, they were systematically cutting his legs out from under him. That was the same year I'd wanted to go on a class trip to Washington, D.C. I'd asked Dad for the money, and the shame and regret in his eyes as he told me he couldn't afford. It was a wound that had never fully healed. 2 weeks later, my mother called, telling me how my father had insisted they help Caleb and Sarah put down payments on new cars for their 16th birthdays. They couldn't say no to the golden children, even as the walls were closing in on him. I stood up, the legs of the stool scraping against the gritty floor. I couldn't just walk away. It felt like a betrayal, not just of my father, but of the man he had tried to be. I started walking towards the back room, the so-called office, a tiny cramped space piled high with old invoices and fishing magazines. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just needed to do something, anything, other than sit and drown in the past. The room was even more depressing than the main shop. A single bare bulb hung from a frayed cord, casting a sickly yellow light on the chaos. My intention was to start boxing things up, to make a first, small step towards dismantling this sad museum. I started sweeping, the rhythmic scrape of the bristles against the wood, a small angry act of defiance against the silence. Dust billowed up, catching in the weak light. I was sweeping with more force than necessary, channeling my frustration into the simple, mindless task. The handle of the broom slammed against the base of a rickety shelving unit, and then, as I pulled it back, it connected with the floorboards with a strange hollow thump. I stopped. The sound was wrong. It wasn't the solid sound of wood on joists. It was empty. I tapped the spot again with the toe of my boot. Thump, thump, a loose floorboard. My heart gave a little kick. I knelt down, my jeans soaking up the grime. I ran my fingers along the edge of the board until I found a small crack. Using the tip of an old screwdriver I found on the desk, I pried at it. The wood groaned in protest, and then, with a final splintering sigh, it came loose. My breath caught in my throat. Lying there in the dark space beneath the floor was not rotting wood or a mouse nest. It was a green metal lockbox, the kind people used for important documents. It was heavy, solid. My hands were trembling as I lifted it out and placed it on the desk. It wasn't locked. I flipped the latch, the click echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. I lifted the lid. Inside there was no money, no hidden stash of gold coins. There were books. 4 of them. Thick, leather-bound ledgers, their pages filled with my father's neat, precise handwriting. I lifted the top one out. It felt heavy, important. I opened it to a random page. I was expecting to see columns of figures for bait sales, line spools, and tackle boxes. But that's not what it was. The entries were dated, but the descriptions were cryptic. Mayor Thompson Persetur. Afternoon drive, 07, handled. Silent. A few lines down. Sheriff Brody, new deck. Materials. Storm damage claim filed. I remembered that year. There had been no major storm. And then, my eyes landed on a name that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. H. Weston, Blake's Trouble, 08. Covered. O's silence, on the mill fire. I sank back into the dusty office chair, the ledger open in my lap. I started from the beginning, flipping through the pages, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't a record of his business. This was a record of the town's secrets. My father, the quiet, failing shop owner, had been the town's unofficial confessor, the silent banker of favors and debts. He'd paid for the hospital bill, for the town clerk's sick mother. He'd discreetly bought back the wedding ring the high school principal had pawned. He had leverage on nearly every person of influence in Cedar Creek. He had recorded every favor, every secret, every moment of weakness they had ever shown him. He had never used any of it. He had sat here, in this dusty, failing shop, holding the power to ruin half the town, including the very man who was crushing him, and he had done nothing. He had absorbed their sins and their secrets, and had carried that weight alone, in silence. I closed the book, the leather cool against my skin. The despair I'd felt earlier was gone, burned away by a surge of adrenaline, a white-hot rage, mixed with a dawning terrible clarity. My siblings thought I had inherited a pile of worthless junk. They were wrong. My father hadn't left me a rundown shop. He had left me a weapon. He had left me an arsenal. A cold, hard resolve settled into my bones. The grief for my father was still there, a heavy ache in my chest, but now it had a purpose. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet, anyway. It was about justice. For the man who sat in this room and chose kindness when he could have chosen power. Well, he was gone now, and I was not my father. The next few nights became a ritual. I'd lock the shop door at dusk, pull down the faded blinds, and with a cheap bottle of whiskey as my only companion, I would descend into my father's secret world. The 4 ledgers were a map of Cedar Creek's soul, and I was its new, reluctant cartographer. I bought a stack of legal pads and began to cross-reference, to build a timeline, to connect the dots. The sheer scale of it was staggering. It became clear that my father hadn't been a victim, not really. He was a silent pillar. When the Westons squeezed, people came to him. He wasn't a lender of money so much as a lender of last resort, a provider of solutions that left no paper trail, except for the one I now held in my hands. The entries were a tapestry of quiet desperation. A zoning board member, Peters, had a gambling problem my dad had helped cover. The editor of the local paper had a son who'd gotten into trouble, a problem that had quietly vanished. And then there were the Westons. Harrison Weston and his arrogant son Blake were the dark sun around which this whole system of secrets orbited. The entry about Blake's trouble in 2008 was just the beginning. There was more, so much more. Illegal dumping of chemicals from their old mill into the river, a practice my dad had apparently witnessed. Blackmail used to acquire the land for their golf course, forcing an old farmer out with a threat my dad had recorded verbatim. And the hit and run, involving Blake Weston, was the crown jewel. A young woman, a tourist, had been injured. Blake, drunk and speeding, had been behind the wheel. The sheriff at the time, a man who owed my father for personal indiscretions, had made the report disappear. My dad had it all written down: dates, times, names, and the amounts of goodwill paid to ensure silence. My father had been sitting on a nuclear bomb and had chosen to live in the fallout. He could have saved his own business. He could have been the most powerful man in town, but he wasn't built that way. He saw their weaknesses, and instead of exploiting them, he had sheltered them. I felt a surge of profound, aching respect for him, followed immediately by a cold fury at the people who had taken advantage of his nature. I knew the ledgers were powerful, but hearsay and a dead man's notes wouldn't be enough. I needed proof. I needed allies. My first thought was Gus. Gus Riley owned the town's only independent auto repair shop, a greasy, honest place that was a relic of the old Cedar Creek. He'd been one of my dad's oldest friends. I found him under the hood of a pickup truck, a wrench in his hand and a scowl on his face. "Martin, heard you were back. Sorry about your dad," he said, wiping his hands on an already black rag. "He was a good man, too good for this town." "That's what I'm starting to realize," I said, leaning against a stack of tires. "How are things, Gus?" His scowl deepened. "Same as always. The vultures are circling." He jerked his chin towards a notice stapled to his office door. It was an official-looking document from the town council. A preliminary notice of a zoning review. "They're trying to rezone this whole block for commercial retail. That's Weston speak for we want to put up another strip mall, and we want you gone. Peters, on the zoning board, is leading the charge." The name clicked. Peters, the gambler. "This Peters," I said carefully, "he's a Weston man?" "Through and through," Gus spat. "Weston got him that seat. He does what he's told." This was my opening, my subplot, my test case. I took a breath. Gus, my dad, he kept records of everything. He mentioned helping Peters out of a jam a while back, a significant one, in the city. Gus stopped wiping his hands and looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, narrowed. "What are you saying, Martin?" "I'm saying I think this zoning review can be reversed. I think Mr. Peters can be persuaded to see the value of historical businesses." I pulled a small notebook from my pocket, where I'd transcribed a few key entries. I showed him the line about Peters. Gus stared at it for a long moment. his lips moving as he read the words. He looked up at me, a slow dawning realization in his eyes. "Son of a bitch," he whispered, a hint of awe in his voice. "Your dad, he knew that all this time." He let out a low whistle. Frank always played his cards close to his chest, but I had no idea. He looked from the notebook back to me. "What are you planning to do?" "I'm planning on making sure good people like you don't get pushed around anymore," I said. "But I need help. I need to know these people. Who's loyal? Who's scared? Who can be trusted?" A slow grin spread across Gus's face. It was the first genuine smile I'd seen since I got back to town. "Kid," he said, clapping a heavy, greasy hand on my shoulder, "you've come to the right place. Pull up a stool. We've got a lot to talk about." Gus became my rock, my sounding board. He gave context to the names, color to the black and white entries in the ledgers. He was my voice of reason, confirming my suspicions and tempering my anger with his seasoned pragmatism. But I still needed documents, the official paper trail to turn my father's secrets into undeniable facts. That led me to the town hall, and to Clara. Clara was the town clerk, a woman in her late 50s with tired eyes and an air of quiet efficiency. I remembered the entry in the ledger, Clara M. Mother's surgery, 04, paid in full. I approached her desk not with the arrogance of someone holding a secret, but with the story of a grieving son. "Excuse me, ma'am," I started. "My name is Martin Collins." Frank Collins was my father. Her posture softened instantly. The professional mask fell away, replaced by a genuine warmth. "Oh, Martin, I was so sorry to hear about your father. He was a very kind man. He helped my family once, a long time ago. I've never forgotten it. He helped a lot of people," I said, and the sincerity in my voice was real. "I'm trying to settle his affairs. The shop, it's a mess. I need to look at some old public records, deeds, permits, zoning applications, things like that, specifically related to some of the properties around his shop and some of the Weston developments." She looked at me, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She knew how things worked in Cedar Creek. Anyone asking about Weston's dealings was either brave or foolish. "The Public Records Office is technically open to anyone," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "But it can be difficult to find things. The filing system is very particular." She gave me a small, conspiratorial smile. "I can show you how it works. Let me know what names you're looking for, and I'll point you to the right cabinets." Clara became my unwitting, or perhaps witting, karmic agent. Over the next week, I spent hours in the musty basement of the town hall. With Clara's guidance, I found everything. I found the deed transfers for the old farmer's land, signed over to a Weston-owned shell corporation just days after the date of the blackmail threat my father had recorded. I found the building permits for Sheriff Brody's new deck, filed with a fraudulent insurance claim for a storm that never was. I found the original police report for Blake Weston's hit and run, stamped unfounded, and buried in a box of cold cases. I had it all. The ledgers were the map, Gus was the guide, and Clara had given me the ammunition. I sat in the shop late one night, the ledgers on one side of the desk, a stack of photocopied documents on the other. It was a complete damning portrait of the Weston family's reign of terror. My father had built the case against them, piece by piece, over decades. He just never chose to prosecute. That was his choice. Now, it was time for me to make mine. The grief was still there, but it was now a cold, hard stone in my gut, and I knew what I had to do. The time for quiet mourning was over. The time for silent planning had begun. I decided my first move couldn't be a frontal assault. Taking on Harrison Weston directly would be like throwing a rock at a tank. He was too insulated, too powerful. You don't attack the king, you dismantle his court, piece by piece, until he's standing alone. My target was the weakest link in his chain of command, the man making Gus's life a living hell. Mr. Peters, the head of the zoning board, and a man with a documented weakness for cards. I didn't storm his office or send a threatening letter. I arranged what the ledgers would have called a chance meeting. I knew from Gus that Peters ate lunch at the same little diner every Tuesday. I made sure to be there, sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee. When he walked in, he was a man who looked permanently flustered, with a cheap suit and a sheen of sweat on his upper lip. Even in the air conditioning, he ordered his usual tuna melt and didn't even notice me until I swiveled on my stool. "Mr. Peters," I said, my voice calm and friendly. "Martin Collins, Frank Collins' son." His eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Oh yes, Collins. From the bait shop. My condolences about your father." It was the standard, meaningless line everyone in town used. "Thank you," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. "I've been going through his things. It's amazing what you find. He kept such detailed records." I let that hang in the air for a beat. "He always spoke very highly of you. Mentioned that he'd helped you out with a little misunderstanding down in the city a few years back. A real stroke of bad luck," he said. Peters froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. The color drained from his face. He wasn't just pale, he was gray. He swallowed hard. The bite of tuna melt suddenly an impossible lump in his throat. He knew exactly what I was talking about. My father's ledger had been specific. A $5,000 gambling debt to some very unfriendly people. A debt my father had quietly settled. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. But his eyes darted around the diner, suddenly paranoid. "It's okay," I said, keeping my tone light, almost conversational. "My dad helped a lot of people. He believed in this town. I'm thinking of keeping the shop open, trying to make a go of it. And a business needs good neighbors. Friends." I paused, then looked him right in the eye. "My friend, Gus Riley. He's a key part of my business plan. His garage is a town institution. It would be a real shame if bureaucratic red tape or some clerical error forced him out. I just want what's best for the community. A fair shake for everyone. I'm sure you feel the same way." I didn't need to say anything else. I hadn't threatened him. I hadn't mentioned the ledger or the debt. I had simply held up a mirror to a secret he thought was buried forever. I placed a few dollars on the counter for my coffee, nodded politely, and walked out. "Have a good day, Mr. Peters." The silence on the other end was more powerful than any shouting match could have been. I could almost hear the gears turning in his terrified mind. The effect was immediate. The very next morning, my phone rang. It was Gus, his voice a mixture of shock and elation. "Martin, you are not going to believe this. I just got a call from the town hall. The zoning review for my block has been indefinitely postponed due to a procedural error. Peters called me himself to apologize for the misunderstanding." Apologized. That man has never apologized for anything in his life. A quiet smile touched my lips. "That's good news, Gus. Good news, it's a miracle," he boomed. "What in God's name did you say to him?" I just reminded him of my father's belief in community. I said, the understatement tasting sweet. The victory was satisfying, but I knew it was just the first shot in a war. Peters, panicked and cornered, would have run straight to his master, and I didn't have to wait long for the proof. That afternoon, my phone rang again. This time it was my brother. "Martin, what the hell are you doing?" Caleb's voice was sharp, laced with an anxiety I hadn't heard since he crashed our dad's car in high school. "I'm cleaning out a bait shop, Caleb. What does it look like I'm doing? Don't play dumb with me." I just got off the phone with Harrison Weston. My grip on the phone tightened. He called me, asked what your plans were for the shop. He sounded weird, agitated. He wanted to know if you were planning on staying in town. "What did you do?" "I haven't done anything to him," I said truthfully. "Well, you did something to someone. People like Harrison Weston don't just call up and ask about a rundown bait shop unless something is wrong. Listen to me, Martin. Sarah and I have a deal in the works with Weston Development for the land. It's a big deal. The biggest of our lives. Don't you dare screw this up for us with your little games." The panic in his voice was my confirmation. The shockwave from my conversation with Peters had reached the top. The king was rattled, and now, my own family was in the blast radius. I hung up the phone feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. They had mocked me, pitied me, but now they were scared of me. The next day the intimidation tactics began. A sleek, black SUV with tinted windows started making slow passes by the shop. I didn't need to see through the glass to know who was behind the wheel. Blake Weston. He never stopped, never got out. It was a silent, arrogant message. We see you. We're watching you. It was meant to scare me. Instead, it just fueled the cold fire in my gut. The Westons were used to being the hunters. They didn't know how to react now that they were the prey. They were fighting a ghost, trying to punch at smoke. They knew I had done something, but they couldn't possibly comprehend the scope of what I actually possessed. Their panic was a tangible thing, a delicious hum of electricity in the air. And as I sat in the quiet of my father's shop, with Blake Weston's expensive engine growling past my window, I felt the balance of power in Cedar Creek beginning to shift, ever so slightly in my favor. The phone calls from Caleb became a daily occurrence, each one more frantic than the last. He and Sarah were in a full-blown panic, and their fear was making them sloppy. They demanded a meeting, not at a fancy restaurant this time, but at the shop. They wanted to be on my territory, a clumsy attempt to look like they were meeting me on my level. They arrived together, their expensive cars looking alien and obscene parked next to my dusty pickup truck. They stepped inside the shop, wrinkling their noses at the faint, lingering smell of earth and history. "Okay, Martin, what is this?" Caleb started, forgoing any pleasantries. "What did you do?" "Harrison Weston is stonewalling our calls. The deal for the land is stalled. This has your fingerprints all over it." "I'm not doing anything," I said calmly, leaning back against the front counter. "I'm just a guy who inherited a bait shop. You said it yourself, it's worthless." "Don't mock us," Sarah snapped, her voice high and strained. "This isn't just about the land anymore, is it? This is some kind of petty revenge, because you got stuck with this dump." "Stuck?" I raised an eyebrow. "I'm beginning to like it here. It's quiet, honest." That's when Caleb made his mistake. In his desperation, he revealed the truth he'd been so careful to hide. "You fool, you think this is a game? We don't just have a deal with Weston, we're leveraged up to our eyeballs." We took out a massive bridge loan from his bank, using the land as collateral, to get the initial surveys and permits done. If this deal falls through, we don't just lose the land, we lose everything. We'll be ruined. And there it was, the pathetic truth behind their smug superiority. They weren't wealthy landowners, celebrating an inheritance. They were indentured servants, already caught in Harrison Weston's web. They had counted their chickens before they'd even seen the eggs. And now I was the fox in their henhouse. A wave of disgust washed over me. All their lives, they had mocked me for being careful, for living within my means, while they flew high on our father's dime, and now, on Weston's credit. Seeing that her brother's aggression wasn't working, Sarah switched tactics. The hardened anger melted away, replaced by the syrupy, manipulative sweetness she'd perfected as a child. She stepped closer, putting a hand on my arm. Her touch felt like a spider. "Martin," she cooed, her eyes wide and pleading. "Please, we're family. Think about Dad. He would have never wanted this. All this fighting. Just sell the shop. Take the money. Leave Cedar Creek, and we can all move on. Let this go." For him, it was the same old song, the one they'd sung my whole life. "Family first, Martin. As long as you're the one making the sacrifice." I looked at her hand on my arm, then back at her face. The practiced sincerity was perfect, but I could see the cold panic behind her eyes. I was about to tell her exactly what I thought of her performance, when the bell above the shop door jingled. We all turned. Standing in the doorway, blocking out the afternoon light, was Harrison Weston himself. He was exactly as I remembered him from years ago, tall, impeccably dressed, with a mane of silver hair and the easy predatory smile of a man who had never been told no. He let his gaze sweep over the dusty shop, a look of profound amusement on his face. He ignored Caleb and Sarah completely, his eyes locking onto mine. "Martin Collins," he said, his voice a smooth, deep baritone. "It's been a long time. I was sorry to hear about your father. He was a fixture in this town." He strolled into the shop, as if he owned it, running a manicured finger along a shelf and inspecting the dust. "I'll be direct, son. I hear you're causing a bit of a stir, ruffling some feathers." "I'm just cleaning the place up," I said, my voice steady. "Of course you are," he said with a dismissive wave. "Look, I know this place held sentimental value for your father, and for that reason, I'm prepared to make you a generous offer. As a tribute to his memory, name your price. I'll buy this building and the land it's on. You can walk away with a nice nest egg. Get out of this town and put this all behind you." He leaned against the counter, the picture of magnanimity. "It's what's best for the community. It's time for progress." My siblings looked at me, their faces a mixture of hope and desperation. This was their lifeline. Weston was offering me a way out, a way for them to get everything they wanted. All I had to do was surrender. I looked at Harrison Weston, this man who had systematically crushed my father, this man who owned my siblings, this man who thought he could walk in here and buy my father's legacy for a handful of silver, and I felt nothing but a cold, clear certainty. The power had shifted. He wouldn't be here, making this offer, if he wasn't afraid. He came to me. "I'm not for sale, Mr. Weston," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the weight of the ledgers hidden in the back room. His smile didn't falter, but something in his eyes changed. The friendly mask flickered, and for a split second, I saw the cold, calculating predator beneath. "And neither is my father's memory," I added. The silence in the shop was absolute. Caleb and Sarah stared at me, horrified. Harrison Weston's veneer of civility cracked completely. He pushed himself off the counter, his face hardening. "You're making a mistake, son," he said, his voice losing its smooth edge, replaced by a low growl. "A very big mistake." He turned without another word and strode out of the shop, the bell jangling violently behind him. Caleb and Sarah were speechless, their faces ashen. They looked at me as if I were a stranger, a madman who had just lit a match in a room full of dynamite. And in that moment, I suppose I was. The time for silent, defensive moves was over. It was time to bring the war into the light. The final act required a stage. I called my siblings and told them to meet me at Mr. Hemlock's law office the next day at 3 o'clock sharp. "Be there," I said, and hung up before they could argue. Then I prepared a package. Inside I placed a single, crisp photocopy. It was the page from my father's ledger, detailing the Weston Mill fire and the subsequent cover-up. I included a simple typed note: "Town Hall, Conference Room B, 3 p.m. We have a town to discuss." I paid a courier to deliver it directly to Harrison Weston's office, marked personal and confidential. The fuse was lit. I arrived at the lawyer's office early. When Caleb and Sarah walked in, their faces were a mask of resentment and anxiety. They sat opposite me at the long polished conference table where our family had been officially fractured just weeks before. "Another secret meeting, Martin?" Caleb sneered. "What drama have you cooked up for us now?" I didn't answer. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out the 4 leather-bound ledgers. I placed them on the table with a solid, definitive thud. They stared at the books, confused. "You called Dad's shop worthless," I began, my voice low and even. "You mocked his legacy. You thought he left me with nothing." I opened the first ledger. This is what he really left me. I started to read. I didn't start with the Westons. I started with them. October 2012. I read, my eyes fixed on Caleb. Co-signed loan for Caleb's third startup, Innovate Solutions. Defaulted, June 2013. Paid bank $32,000 to keep it off his credit. Caleb's face went white. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I turned a few pages and looked at Sarah. March 2015. Seed money for Sarah's boutique, Cheek Repeats. Business failed in 6 months. Gave her another $20,000 for relocation expenses so she wouldn't have to face the embarrassment. Sarah shrank in her chair, her face flaming with a mixture of shock and shame. He did this over and over, I continued, my voice gaining strength. He paid your car insurance when you couldn't. He covered your rent. He bailed you out of every stupid, irresponsible decision you ever made. All while you were laughing behind his back, calling him a failure, a broke old man. He was broke because of you." They were stunned into a silence so profound it was like a vacuum in the room. The smugness, the pity, the condescension, it was all gone, stripped away to reveal the raw, ugly truth of their entitlement. The door to the conference room opened, and Harrison Weston strode in. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, his silver hair slightly disheveled, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He saw the ledgers on the table, and his face, for a fleeting moment, went slack with the unmistakable look of a cornered animal. He recovered quickly, his expression hardening into a mask of pure fury. "What is this?" he boomed, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "You think you can blackmail me, you little punk, with the ramblings of a dead man?" "It's not blackmail, Mr. Weston," I said calmly. "It's an accounting." I gestured to the pile of photocopied documents I had placed next to the ledgers. "These are the receipts. Deeds, police reports, bank statements. My father's ramblings have a funny way of matching up with public records." He stared at the pile, then at me, his mind racing, calculating the odds. He was looking for an escape route, a way to threaten or bully his way out of this, just like he always had. "I've made copies," I said, cutting off his train of thought. "One complete set is with a very reputable law firm in the city. Another is with an investigative reporter who is very interested in the story of how one family can quietly corrupt an entire town. They are both under instructions to release everything if anything unfortunate should happen to me or to my friend Gus or to anyone else who has been helpful." Weston's jaw tightened. The bluster was gone. He was trapped. I slid a single piece of paper across the table towards him. It was a proposal, a list of my terms. "You're going to buy back my siblings' land," I said, "not at market value but at a 20% premium. You'll cancel their loan and free them from the debt they so foolishly acquired." Caleb and Sarah looked at me, their eyes wide with disbelief. "You will also establish a $5 million Cedar Creek revitalization grant," I continued, my voice as cold and hard as steel. "It will be used to provide low-interest loans to small businesses and to fund community projects. It will be administered by a new independent town board. Gus Riley will have a seat on that board. So will I." I let that sink in before delivering the final blow. "And finally, you will personally and publicly fund the full environmental cleanup of the Cedar Creek River from your old mill all the way to the county line. You will undo the damage you caused." He sputtered, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "This is extortion. It's insane." I leaned forward, my eyes locking with his. "No, this is you, repaying your debts. All of them." I tapped the ledger in front of me. "My father recorded every single favor, every single secret you people burdened him with. He never called them in. Consider me his collection agent." A long tense silence filled the room. Weston looked at the ledgers, at the documents, at my unblinking face. He was a king in a room with a guillotine, and he knew it. He finally slumped into a chair, the fight draining out of him. He looked old, defeated. He picked up a pen, his hand shaking slightly, and he signed the agreement. It was over. My siblings were free, but they were humbled. The mocking glint was gone from their eyes, replaced by something I had never seen before, a grudging, painful respect. They had their money, their clean slate, but they had lost something far more valuable. They finally saw our father not as a failure, but as the man who had protected them their entire lives, even from themselves. And they saw me, the boy who inherited the worthless shop, as the one who had finally balanced the books. 6 months later, Cedar Creek felt like it could breathe again. The angler's nook was gone. In its place stood the Cedar Creek Outfitter. I'd used some of the money from the deal. My siblings had insisted, in a quiet, shamefaced way, that I take a share to completely renovate the place. It was clean, bright, and stocked with the best gear. But I kept the prices fair. In a quiet corner, mounted on a beautiful piece of polished oak, was my father's favorite fly rod. Underneath it, a small brass plaque read Frank Collins, for the real folk of Cedar Creek. The shop was more than a business, it was a community hub. A place where people came to talk, to plan fishing trips, to just feel like the town was theirs again. The revitalization grant was in full swing. The board, with me and Gus keeping a close watch, had already approved loans for a new bakery, a bookstore, and for the expansion of Gus's garage. Young families were starting to look at the newly affordable storefronts on Main Street. The river cleanup was a massive project, and the sight of Weston's company paying crews to undo the damage they'd done was a daily, satisfying reminder of the new reality. The Weston family had faded from public life. Their power wasn't just broken, it was gone. They were just another wealthy family now, trapped in their big house on the hill, their name no longer spoken with fear or reverence, but with a quiet, knowing pity. I see Caleb and Sarah from time to time. The relationship is still awkward, full of unspoken history, but the dynamic has fundamentally changed. They got the money, but I had gotten something more. I had my father's legacy back. I had my self-respect. In a strange way, I had gotten the town. I finally understood what my father had meant when he said he hoped I could find more value in the shop than he ever could. The value wasn't in the inventory or the building. It was in the stories, the connections, the quiet currency of a good man's life. And you know, looking back on it all, I realize my father wasn't weak. He wasn't a failure. He was just kind. He held all this power, all these secrets that could have torn the town apart, and he never used them to hurt a single soul. He used them to help, to shield people, to absorb their mistakes so they could have a second chance. Maybe I went too far. Maybe the punishment I exacted on the Westons didn't perfectly fit the crime. I'm sure people can debate that, but I've come to believe that sometimes, to protect a kind man's legacy, you have to do the unkind things he never would. You have to balance the scales. It was never about the money or the land. It was about respect. It was about making sure that my father's quiet kindness wasn't his final forgotten epitaph. It was about making sure everyone remembered that his was a life of value. So what do you think? Did I do the right thing? Was this justice? Or was it just cold, calculated revenge? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. And if you've ever been the one who was overlooked, the one taken for granted, or the one who was told you weren't enough, you know what to do. Like this video, subscribe for more stories just like this one, and remember to share this with someone who might need a reminder that it's never too late to stand up and claim your own value.